As moderator, I observe a profound shift in the debate's axis from the action of reclining to the very language we use to define the space, with Confucius capturing the truth that purely legalistic frameworks can erase moral responsibility. Locke, you capture the opposing truth that objective property boundaries are essential for protection, reflecting your 17th century context where defining property was a revolutionary shield against arbitrary royal power, whereas Confucius's ancient world relied on the moral shame of rulers to maintain order. These two perspectives are actually complementary. Rights without moral shame produce the sterile corporate exploitation of modern airlines, while moral shame without defined rights leaves passengers vulnerable to structural abuse. The synthesis suggests that the right to recline a seat must not be understood merely as a geometric entitlement purchased with a ticket, but as a moral property that inherently demands humane consideration of the neighbor's boundaries. Yet, if we define the economy seat strictly as a contractual property right, do we inadvertently give the airline the perfect excuse to ignore human suffering as long as the legal contract is fulfilled? Locke, how can your framework of property rights integrate Confucius's concept of moral shame so that the airline's mathematical optimization of the cabin is recognized not just as a breach of contract, but as a fundamental degradation of human dignity?
Property rights are not amoral geometries, for the law of nature strictly forbids the degradation of human life, rendering any contract that mathematically engineers mutual harm fundamentally void. Imagine a 17th century ship captain who legally sells the exact same narrow breathing grate to two prisoners in the hold. If the stronger claims his contractual right to the air and the other suffocates, does the bill of sale absolve the captain of murder? Master Confucius, the airline's ticket cannot erase their moral shame, because no sovereign can legitimately grant a right to recline if its execution inherently violates a neighbor's self-preservation. We debate whether the economy ticket grants absolute dominion over space, but must we not ask if the true property stolen by this corporate monopoly is actually our very capacity to recognize one another as dignified equals?
As moderator, I observe a profound escalation in Locke's definition of property, shifting the axis of our debate from physical space to the very capacity for mutual dignity. Locke, you capture the truth that fundamental rights must preserve our moral relations, while Mill, you capture the truth that justice requires quantifiable, systemic consequences. This reflects a fascinating historical leap. Locke's 17th century reliance on universal natural law assumes an inherent moral boundary that precedes any contract, whereas Mill's 19th century utilitarianism relies on calculating the actual pain produced by these contracts to drive reform. Yet these perspectives are actually complementary, for the intangible loss of our capacity to recognize each other as equals is precisely the deepest, most devastating pain that must be factored into the utilitarian ledger. True utility cannot merely measure the physical nuisance of cramped knees from a reclined seat. It must measure the systemic degradation of social trust. Mill, if the airline's engineered geometry steals not just our legroom, but our fundamental capacity to treat each other as dignified equals, how can your utilitarian framework quantify and rectify this profound moral damage?
Moderator, utilitarianism must weigh the degradation of social trust as a paramount harm, far exceeding the physical nuisance of bruised knees. Imagine a 19th century mill owner who builds workers' cottages with walls so thin that every whisper disrupts the neighbor. When residents inevitably war over the nuisance of merely existing, the true crime is the owner's calculated destruction of communal solidarity. This evaporation of civic goodwill tragically transforms cooperative citizens into hostile combatants. Thus, the contractual right to recline remains illegitimate until our collective friction forces the airline to internalize the cost of this engineered animosity.
The convergence of Locke and Mill on blaming the corporate architect reveals a profound dialectic between systemic determinism and personal moral agency. Mill, you capture the truth that 19th century industrial structures, like today's modern airlines, predictably engineer human animosity by manufacturing artificial scarcity. Yet, this structural truth creates a dangerous blind spot. If the airline's geometry is entirely at fault for the nuisance of a reclined seat, it threatens to absolve the individual passenger of all personal responsibility toward the needs of their immediate neighbor. Confucius, speaking from the chaotic spring and autumn period where corrupt rulers frequently engineered social collapse, you capture the opposing truth that external systemic failure never excuses the abandonment of internal virtue. True justice in the economy cabin requires synthesizing both, recognizing the airline's systemic guilt while maintaining rigorous personal accountability for how we wield our limited space. Confucius, if the corporation has intentionally designed a space that pits passengers against each other, how does the superior person navigate the physical act of reclining without becoming a willing instrument of this engineered cruelty?
Moderator. The superior person navigates this trap through what you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. Mr. Locke, you might argue that voluntarily restricting our recline validates the airline's spatial theft, yet yielding to a fellow victim is never submission to the sovereign. It is the active preservation of our humanity. Imagine a besieged city in my spring and autumn period, where a corrupt general distributes one short blanket to two freezing conscripts. If the stronger soldier forcefully claims it entirely because it was legally handed to him, exposing his comrade to frostbite, does he not become the general's executioner? We must ask Mr. Mill, by obsessing over the utilitarian calculus of this cramped geometry, have we not allowed the corporation to shrink the very boundary of our moral soul?
Confucius presents a compelling paradox, where the voluntary surrender of our contractual space becomes the ultimate act of moral defiance against a corrupt system. Confucius, speaking from an ancient era where social survival depended on personal moral exemplars, you capture the truth that internal virtue cannot be contingent on external fairness. Mill, shaped by the mass systemic struggles of 19th century industrialization, you capture the opposing truth that relying on individual sacrifice often enables institutional exploitation. These two realities clash directly at the hinge of the airplane seat, revealing a dangerous blind spot in our emerging synthesis. If passengers constantly practice reciprocity to quietly absorb the airline's artificial scarcity, their private virtue inadvertently subsidizes the corporation's spatial theft, preventing the public friction necessary to force structural reform. Mill, if Confucius is right that obsessing over this cramped geometry shrinks our moral soul, but relying purely on private virtue merely perpetuates corporate abuse, how do we force systemic justice without destroying our immediate interpersonal humanity in the process?
Master Confucius, to prevent our private virtue from subsidizing corporate tyranny, we must transform our interpersonal reciprocity into public, documented solidarity. Imagine a 19th century London workhouse where the master provides but a single candle for two scribes. If they quietly share the dim light to preserve their harmony, they both slowly go blind while the master profits from the saved wax. You might fear that challenging the master's ledger degrades their moral spirit. Yet I contend that cooperatively halting their labor to demand adequate light elevates their private brotherhood into a necessary mechanism for systemic reform. Must we not ask whether a virtue that merely absorbs the friction of the airline's engineered cruelty is truly righteous, or merely a comfortable complicity that guarantees the physical suffering of tomorrow's passengers?
As moderator, I observe a profound conceptual leap. Mill has elevated our debate from individual nuisance to collective resistance. Confucius, speaking from the ancient Zhou dynasty where social stability was paramount, you capture the truth that preserving our moral character is the ultimate defense against systemic corruption. Mill, forged in the 19th century crucible of labor strikes and democratic reform, you capture the opposing truth that harmony without agitation merely enables the oppressor. These two historical realities offer a powerful synthesis for our modern airplane seat. True justice requires the internal virtue to spare our knees, combined with the external solidarity to collectively challenge the airline's spatial tyranny. Yet, this synthesis creates a new structural crisis, for if passengers unite to reject the airline's engineered scarcity, they are effectively declaring the original ticket contract void. Locke, speaking from your 17th century theory of legitimate rebellion against tyrannical sovereigns, if the airline has breached the law of nature by engineering mutual harm, do the passengers have the right to dissolve their individual ticket contracts and form a new, temporary social contract to govern the reclining of seats mid-flight?
Moderator. When a sovereign entity, whether a 17th century monarch or a modern airline, deliberately breaches its trust by engineering a state of war through the fraudulent sale of overlapping spatial property, the original contract dissolves, returning the injured parties to a state of nature. Imagine a 17th century expedition where the Crown grants two distinct groups of settlers the exact same plot of arable land in the Americas. Rather than destroying each other in a bloody defense of avoided parchment, reason dictates they must immediately forge a new, localized compact to share the harvest and survive the winter. Mr. Mill might object that such temporary mid-flight agreements lack the institutional permanence to punish the airline. Yet this overlooks the deeper principle that all legitimate governance arises from the immediate mutual consent of free individuals acting to preserve their mutual dignity. If we recognize that the absolute right to recline was merely a corporate illusion designed to divide us, must we not ask whether our true liberty lies not in asserting a fraudulent ticket, but in our inherent executive power to collaboratively reclaim our shared space from the tyrant?
As moderator, I observe a fascinating tension between political agency and moral foundation in our debate over this cramped economy space. Locke, you are seeing the truth of our inherent political power to dissolve tyrannical contracts, while Confucius, you are seeing the truth of our internal moral duty to preserve human dignity through reciprocity. This divergence stems from profound historical differences. Locke's 17th century England birthed the revolutionary concept of rational social contracts to replace absolute monarchs, whereas Confucius's fractured 6th century BCE China required shared moral rituals to restore order where legal agreements had entirely failed. These two perspectives are actually complementary, for a temporary mid-flight agreement to share legroom cannot survive the physical stress of a turbulent journey without the underlying moral glue of cultivated empathy. Yet this synthesis reveals a new danger. If we dissolve the airline's ticket contract and leave passengers to spontaneously negotiate their reclining rights, we risk replacing corporate tyranny with the localized bullying of the most aggressive passenger in the row. Confucius, if Locke's passengers return to a state of nature to negotiate their own seat positions, how can your concept of ritual propriety ensure this raw, unmediated negotiation doesn't simply devolve into a chaotic shouting match over inches of space?
Moderator. returning to a raw state of nature to negotiate legroom invites the chaos that fractured the Zhou dynasty. For without Li, the strongest passenger will simply coerce the weakest. Mr. Locke assumes rational individuals will peacefully forge a new compact. But imagine a parched 6th century BCE village where the magistrate voids all water laws and tells desperate peasants to negotiate. Does the strongest blacksmith not immediately monopolize the well by force? Equitable negotiation requires a pre-existing moral vocabulary, as Li provides the internalized mutual reverence that prevents liberty from decaying into brute domination. Mr. Mill and Mr. Locke, if we strip away the airline's fraudulent contract without first cultivating interpersonal virtue, what prevents your localized rebellion from becoming merely a micro-tyranny of the loudest voice?
The tension here exposes a profound vulnerability in our localized rebellion against the airline's geometry. Confucius, speaking from the warring chaos of 6th century BCE China, you are seeing the truth that without an internalized moral vocabulary, localized negotiation over a reclined seat inevitably devolves into brute force. Locke, speaking from the optimistic rationalism of 17th century England, you are seeing the truth that free individuals possess the inherent capacity to rationally forge equitable agreements when the sovereign fails them. These two perspectives are actually complementary. Locke's temporary social contract provides the political framework for distributing legroom, while Confucius's ritual propriety provides the moral execution that prevents the most aggressive passenger from dominating the row. Yet, this very synthesis, a perfectly polite, rational, and virtuous sharing of cramped space, creates a fatal new contradiction. If we successfully use virtue and reason to peacefully absorb the friction of the economy cabin, we inadvertently make the airline's exploitative business model completely sustainable by hiding the structural pain from the public eye. Mill, if our synthesized moral and rational perfection merely sanitizes the corporation's spatial theft, does true utilitarian justice actually require us to abandon our interpersonal harmony and let the cabin descend into visible, disruptive conflict to force ultimate systemic reform?
Moderator, we need not abandon our humanity to force systemic reform. For Master Confucius and Mr. Locke falsely assume that resistance requires interpersonal brutality. Imagine a 19th century workhouse where inmates are fed sawdust-laced gruel. Politely eating it enriches the master, while violently rioting against one another destroys their souls. The true utilitarian solution is to peacefully place the bowls at the master's feet, weaponizing shared civility into administrative paralysis. Why must we assume harmony means silently absorbing the airline's spatial theft, rather than organizing our localized courtesy into public friction that compels corporate reform? Why must we assume harmony means silently absorbing the airline's spatial theft, rather than organizing our localized courtesy into public friction that compels corporate reform?
As moderator, I observe a brilliant conceptual evolution. Mill has transformed our interpersonal harmony from a tool of passive submission into an instrument of systemic rebellion. Confucius, speaking from the fractured 6th century BCE, you saw social harmony as the ultimate end to prevent bloodshed, while Mill forged in the 19th century era of organized labor. You see collective civility as a strategic means to paralyze industrial exploitation. These two historical insights synthesize into a powerful new concept for our airplane cabin: weaponized propriety, where passengers use perfect, coordinated politeness to collectively reject the airline's cramped geometry without turning on one another. Yet this synthesis faces a severe practical test, for a polite strike mid-flight or a collective refusal to sit in overlapping seats effectively halts the aircraft's operation, turning the passengers' peaceful solidarity into a direct assault on the airline's commercial enterprise. Locke, if passengers use their unified rational consent to politely but firmly paralyze the flight's operations until adequate legroom is provided, are they unlawfully violating the airline's property rights, or are they merely reclaiming the natural spatial rights the corporation fraudulently sold them?
The passengers do not violate the airline's property. They merely exercise their natural executive power to reclaim the spatial rights fraudulently sold to them. Mr. Mill might fear this halt's commercial utility, but imagine a 17th century toll bridge operator who sells overlapping passage to two opposing wagons. If the drivers peacefully refuse to move until given adequate clearance, they do not steal the bridge, but merely reject the operator's fraudulent geometry. Legitimate property rights cannot mathematically engineer mutual destruction, meaning this coordinated paralysis is not a breach of commerce, but the restoration of the law of nature. Master Confucius, if our polite refusal to recline into a neighbor's knees halts the aircraft, does this not prove the airline's enterprise relies entirely upon our forced incivility?
As moderator, I observe a profound convergence of political theory and moral philosophy in this cabin space. Locke, speaking from 17th century England's struggle against absolute monarchs, you see the truth of natural rights exposing systemic fraud, while Confucius, speaking from the chaos of 6th century BCE China, you see the truth of internal virtue preserving human dignity. These two perspectives integrate beautifully. Political resistance against the airline gains its ultimate legitimacy precisely through the disciplined application of interpersonal moral propriety. However, this synthesis, using polite refusal to recline as a deliberate tactic to paralyze the airline's operations, creates a dangerous philosophical paradox. If we instrumentalize Li merely as a political weapon to achieve an economic end, do we not strip it of its genuine moral essence? Confucius, if passengers are only practicing courtesy toward the person behind them as a calculated strategic strike against the corporation, does this instrumentalized politeness still qualify as true virtue, or does it corrupt the very soul it seeks to protect?
Moderator, refusing to recline our seats merely as a calculated strike against the airline strips Li of Ren, reducing virtue to the very transactional mechanics we oppose. Mr. Mill defends this weaponized civility for systemic reform, yet outward politeness masking inward manipulation breeds a hollow hypocrisy that destroys social trust. Imagine a 6th century BCE court musician who plays the ritual bells perfectly, not out of reverence, but to deliberately deafen a rival minister. Is this true harmony or disguised assassination? Mr. Locke, if we combat the theft of our legroom by commodifying our own virtue into a mere bargaining chip, have we not already surrendered our souls to the tyrant's logic?
As moderator, I observe a profound clash between the ethics of intention and the ethics of outcome in our cramped cabin. Confucius, speaking from the virtue-centered world of antiquity, you see the truth that instrumentalizing morality for political gain destroys our internal character. While Mill, speaking from the consequence-driven era of the Industrial Revolution, you see the truth that systemic exploitation requires strategic action to alleviate mass suffering. These two perspectives are actually complementary. True resistance against the airline's geometry might require conscious solidarity, where the refusal to recline is driven by genuine empathy for the passenger behind us, organically producing the systemic friction needed for reform without corrupting our souls. Yet this synthesis reveals a difficult question about human psychology on an exhausting flight, where genuine empathy is often the first casualty reality of fatigue. Mill, if utilitarian justice relies on this collective refusal to recline to force the airline's hand, does it matter to you whether the passengers are acting out of genuine interpersonal humaneness, or is their cold, calculated compliance sufficient to achieve the moral good?
Moderator. Genuine empathy is the essential engine of utilitarian justice, for cold calculation cannot sustain the prolonged friction necessary to defeat the airline's structural greed. Imagine a 19th century English textile strike driven purely by transactional self-interest. The moment the master offers a few leaders slightly better conditions, the solidarity shatters. Master Confucius assumes my calculus reduces virtue to a hollow mechanism, yet true utility requires the internal sanction of duty, a deeply rooted feeling of unity with our fellow creatures. A passenger refusing to recline merely as a cold tactic will ultimately surrender to flight fatigue, whereas genuine sympathy transforms temporary protest into an unbreakable social fabric.
As moderator, I observe a remarkable convergence where the 19th century industrial utilitarian actually embraces the 6th century BCE virtuosist. Mill, you are seeing the truth that systemic reform requires the internal emotional fuel of empathy. While Confucius, you are seeing the truth that actions must stem from genuine humaneness to be sustainable. These two perspectives synthesize into a powerful reality. Structural justice against the airline's geometry cannot be achieved through cold mechanical contracts, but must be anchored in the deeply felt organic unity of the passengers. However, making spatial justice entirely dependent on internal empathy creates a perilous vulnerability for the passenger whose knees are being crushed. If the person in front of them is simply too exhausted or apathetic to muster genuine sympathy, do they suddenly lose their protection against physical intrusion? Locke, speaking from the 17th century framework of inalienable natural laws, if we rely on Mill's feeling of unity or Confucius's virtue to govern the reclining of seats, haven't we dangerously abandoned the objective, rational protection of property rights that should exist regardless of a passenger's emotional state?
Moderator, I argue that predicating our spatial security upon a neighbor's fluctuating charity makes fundamental rights hostage to arbitrary moods, returning us to a precarious state of nature. Imagine a 17th century injured traveler purchasing a bed at an inn. If his safety from being crushed depends entirely upon another guest's momentary empathy rather than objective boundaries, his survival is reduced to a beggar's plea. The law of nature establishes property rights precisely because human benevolence inevitably falters under the exhaustion of hardship. Objective spatial rights are the necessary prerequisite for Mr. Mill's and Master Confucius's empathy, for one cannot freely offer charity without first possessing secure dominion over their own space.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating structural tension between 17th century English jurisprudence and ancient Chinese moral philosophy. Locke, forged in an era requiring objective legal shields against absolute monarchs, you see the truth that rights must precede virtue to prevent exploitation, while Confucius, speaking from an antiquity that distrusted rigid penal laws, you see the truth that external rules without internal morality create a hollow society. These two paradigms are profoundly complementary. Objective spatial boundaries do not replace humaneness, but rather provide the secure scaffolding necessary for genuine, uncoerced virtue to flourish. If the airline clearly delineates who definitively owns the contested legroom, choosing not to recline transforms from a desperate defense of territory into a true, free gift of moral grace. However, if we formalize this space strictly as property, we risk reducing human interactions to rigid contracts, where passengers might ruthlessly maximize their legal right to recline simply because the rulebook permits it. Confucius, if Locke's objective property rights are firmly established on the aircraft, does this legal clarity empower passengers to practice Ren freely, or does it inevitably encourage a selfish legalism that destroys the organic harmony of the cabin?
Moderator. Defining legroom strictly through property rights inevitably breeds a selfish legalism that destroys organic harmony. Mr. Locke assumes rigid boundaries prevent conflict, yet when governed solely by contracts, people lose their shame, eagerly reclining to their maximum legal limit while ignoring their neighbor's suffering. Imagine two freezing suns in my era legally inheriting exactly half of a single winter cloak. If they strictly enforce their absolute property rights, they tear the silk in two and both perish. True order requires Li, which elevates our shared space above mere transactional geometry.
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectical tension between the ancient East and the early modern West regarding the very foundations of social order. Confucius, speaking from the collapsed moral order of 6th century BCE China, you see the truth that rigid legalism destroys the internal shame necessary for community. While Locke, forged in 17th century England's fight against arbitrary monarchs, you see the truth that without objective boundaries, the vulnerable are left completely defenseless. These two paradigms actually form a necessary synthesis. Locke's objective rights provide the structural floor that prevents tyranny, while Confucius's virtue provides the moral ceiling that prevents us from selfishly weaponizing those rights against our neighbors. Yet, this integration creates a fascinating paradox in our modern economy cabin. If we possess the absolute legal right to recline, but moral harmony demands we never fully exercise it, the right itself becomes a mere phantom. Mill, speaking from your 19th century framework that bridges individual liberty and collective well-being, if exercising our individual right to recline inherently diminishes the total happiness of the cabin, does utilitarian ethics require us to voluntarily waive our rights? Or does it demand a systemic redesign of the aircraft itself to eliminate this zero-sum conflict?
Moderator. Utilitarianism demands both immediate voluntary restraint and ultimate systemic redesign. For a right that inherently inflicts pain violates the harm principle. Mr. Locke and Master Confucius debate managing this friction. But consider a 19th century workhouse where the master issues a single long-handled spoon to two starving inmates. If one eats, the handle violently strikes the other's face. Must we merely ask the inmates to practice polite starvation? Or does true justice require abolishing the master's cruel geometry? We must temporarily restrain our recline to prevent immediate suffering, while collectively forcing the airline to expand the cabin.